getting things moving again. It was lovely to see everyone catching up over morning tea. Nothing like a scone and cream and jam, and good company. So while you're getting settled, I'm just going to make an announcement before we move on to our first keynote. When you got your pouch, it should have had a couple of gold stars in it. And if you haven't got them, please go to the registration desk and get yourself a couple. They look like this. ALWS Gifts of Grace. What the organising committee decided to do was not further pollute the planet with gift bags with gifts in them that people tend not to use. They might not. We thought, no, we'll give everyone a gift of grace. So this is your opportunity. Part of your registration fee has gone to giving a gift of grace. So basically, you've got 2 lots of $5 to go to the pin board that's in the exhibition hall, and you can then allocate that you'd like $5 to go to this one, $5 to that one. You might want 10 to go to one of those, and we will use that to then distribute your giving. So that's what your gold stars are for. So now I'd like to call Sue Ellis up, please, to introduce our first keynote.
Good afternoon and welcome back for morning tea. Odd that we're saying good afternoon after morning tea. My name is Sue Ellis and I'm privileged to be the principal at Geelong Lutheran College, St John's Newtown and Armstrong Creek campuses, and it's great to see you. Thank you, there's our team. And welcome to all of our virtual audience as well. It's so lovely to know that you're there. It's really lovely to have had that break, and I encourage you to continue to use those breaks to continue building relationships with your fellow Lutheran educators, to catch up with friends that you haven't seen for a while, and also, and very importantly, I encourage you to support our sponsors by visiting them in their at their booths, because without them we would be struggling to have this wonderful opportunity to gather together. You should all have your app, your conference app, which you made sure you had when you came in this morning, and we are going to ask you to use the app to be able to upload any questions that you might have from our keynote speakers. If you go to the keynote session and click on it, you will see it will take you to a question and answer or Q&A session. If you click onto that section, you will be able to submit your question. We encourage you to do this because it allows our virtual audience to participate in what's going on here, and also allows our keynote speakers to be able to respond to anything that you might be curious about. So please use that. So have that. This is one of those times you can use your phones and nobody will mind. So thank you. It's a real privilege, having waited for so long to have this event, to be able to have our international keynote speaker, the Reverend Dr. Chad Rimmer. Chad is an ordained Lutheran pastor and currently serves as the Program Executive for Identity, Communion and Formation at the Lutheran World Federation in Geneva, Switzerland. He's the author of several articles, the book Greening the Children of God, Thomas Traherne and Nature's Role in the Ecological Formation of Children, and a collection of poetry titled Yellow, Chemopoetry from a Caretaker's Journey. Growing up in the USA, Chad has lived, served and taught around the world among cultures, lifestyles and languages of multi-religious people in Scandinavia, Scotland and Senegal in West Africa. Would you please give him a very warm ACL conference welcome, Chad Rimmer. Thank you.
Thank you, friends. I bring you greetings from the Lutheran World Federation, the communion of 149 Lutheran churches around the globe in 7 regions where I serve, as Sue said, in Geneva, Switzerland. But as she also mentioned, that's not where I grew up, so I want to introduce myself also by saying that I'm a husband, I'm a father, and I'm a caretaker. of people and places that I love. And one of those is the Appalachian Mountains in eastern United States, where I grew up and was blessed by the tradition of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Native Americans. And all of this plays into my understanding of who I am and where I am in the world. And so now, here I am, and here we are. And I'm grateful to Lutheran Education Australia for the chance to contribute now for the second year in a row. And it was great to be together online last time, but I have to say, in terms of education and formation, how much greater it is to be able to be together and to be able to just resonate with each other in a real embodied relationship, which will be part of my keynote message for today. And I also want to share a word of gratitude for the way that LEA honors your identity as part of the global Lutheran family through the Lutheran Church in Australia and New Zealand. And so it's great to greet Bishop Smith and all of our friends from LCA and Z. For all of our educators and guests who are here that maybe don't identify with the Lutheran tradition, I want to begin with a short and basic affirmation of Lutherans' commitment to education by recalling the importance of education in Luther's project. Luther and Melanchthon, who are pictured here, ensured that primary education was a right of all girls and boys in Saxony in the 16th century, because they knew that it was the seedbed for the faithful formation and the reformation of the social, ecclesial, economic, and political spheres. So education continues to be a center that holds, as our confession compels us, deeper into the work of social and ecological transformation, reconciliation, and peace building in our age today. Now, last year I spoke about the link between Lutheran theological methods and transformative pedagogy. But today, I want to hone in on an impulse that I take from the conference theme: one voice, many paths. And this theme, there's such a dynamic tension and a creative tension in this theme. I'm going to focus on many paths in terms of epistemological diversity. I'm going to begin theologically, and then I'm going to talk a bit about an anthropological perspective, and then I hope, with some degree of satisfaction for a room full of experienced educators, that I'll circle back to point to some of the pedagogical implications of many paths. So I want to begin with this theological frame. Now, I don't know if it was intentional, but the theme of this conference lands squarely within one of the first and greatest philosophical questions of all time: the question of the universal and the particular, the one and the many. And at its heart, it's a question about diversity and a question about relationship. What am I, and how do I relate to these other beings that seem so different from me in the world around us? And one of the first recorded disagreements about the one and the many happened between the two pre-Socratic Greeks. And here you see them in Raphael's painting, The School of Athens, that hangs in the Vatican. Parmenides on your left and Heraclitus on the right. Parmenides believed that there was a true, unchanging, knowable reality, a oneness, a being that was permanent. And you see him standing here with his foot on a block of stone. That only reality is this one being that exists, and we are statically related to each other in this fixed order. For him, the appearance of diverse bodies and diverse different beings is only due to our perception. So fear not. In a world of diversity that often comes into conflict, Parmenides wanted you to be assured of the triumph of a single order over chaos. Difference, diversity, change, and movement is just an illusion. Heraclitus countered this argument by moving. He said that the universe was, in fact, in flux. Time and space were real. We certainly share the same being with other creatures, but the universe is creatively becoming, and so too are each one of us in it. This is because there was a creative force from which all life processes. Panta re, he said in Greek, everything flows. And you might know him for another reason. His enduring image was that of a river. He's the one who said, you cannot step into a river, the same river twice, because it's always changing as it flows. And so you see him here seated with his feet out, as if his feet are in the edge of a river. But for Heraclitus, this was his point. Contingency is not chaos. Our becoming is the order of things. Our change and our becoming is the order of things. We're participating in the creative order of a living word, a logos that is constantly creating and recreating. And here's his important point. Our becoming requires relationships. If we're going to become, we need relationships to these other diverse beings around us. So Heraclitus shifts the focus from what we are to why we need each other. Because we can be of the same stuff. You, the trees, the fish, and me, and our bodies are not static individuals, dualities in this world, but rather are interdependent relationships to one another with their synergies and their resistances. They influence our becoming. Together, we become something new. Now, this philosophical idea is actually expressed biologically at the level of cellular human development. Because within the first few days after conception, our cells have divided into dozens of identical, unspecialized cells called a blastocyst. That's the one on the far right, your far left. There is no difference in these cells. There's no diversity. These are totipotent cells. They're all the same, but according to where those cells are in relationship to one another within that blastocyst, they will specialize into different tissues. So some, close to the outside, will become our nervous system. Some, at the bottom, will become part of our digestive system, and some that are around the edges will become our skeletal and our muscular tissue. And the thing about these cells is it's their proximity to one another that triggers their genetic expression. So in fact, when these pluripotent embryonic cells are separated and grown in a lab for stem cell purposes, when they grow on their own, they do not differentiate. So it's their relationship to each other that actually influences what they are becoming. So you see, this is not just a conversation between two Greeks. The implications persist today because these questions about the benefit or the threat of diversity and plurality are at the heart of a lot of hot political debates about who we are as nations, social theories about gender and families, and the natural social sciences when it comes to deciding together what makes for justice and peace in the world. So a question for us is, what can we say about this theologically? Well, theologically, this process of relational becoming is the basis of the field of constructive theology. The theological question at its heart is echoed and told in every narrative of cosmogenesis, every creation story across all cultures. And all creation narratives are in part asking this question: do we exist in a static, zero-sum dualistic universe where each of us has to exert our own individual power, which means we're usually caught in some conflict, whether it's personal or cosmic? Or are our mutual relationships the source of our creative power? Christians approach this question not philosophically, but according to theological questions about what God has revealed to us. And while there are thousands of verses in Hebrew scripture and Christian scriptures that talk about what God is like, the only place in the Bible where anyone makes a claim about what God is in 1 John. God is love. But theology is not just about what God is. Theology shifts the focus from the substance of God to the subsistence of us in God. Like Heraclitus, we shift from substance to the relationship question, because love requires a relationship. So for Christians, the deep incarnation of Christ and the witness to Christ in scriptures reveal that divine love is expressed as a trinity, a relationship in communion. And communion implies a union of diverse things. So in the case of God, it's the mystery of three subsisting in a perfect relationship of love. In Greek, that's called perichoresis. It's a dance, the dance of perfect unity of diversity. This is the mystic's way of experiencing the mystery of the one and the many. So in other words, the one and the many is not a reality to fear, and it's not a philosophical problem to solve. It's a mystery that gives us the creativity to make meaning in the world and to know how we belong to each other. So theologians and philosophers in the room, and I know there are some, will recognize this as a doxological claim. The shape of God provides us with a key for understanding a diversity of being in the world as a gift, relationality, and the many paths of our becoming. So the mystics, St. Bonaventure, Hildegard, Julian of Norwich, describe the Trinity as a communion of love. And the communion of love has two moves: creation and reconciliation, breathing out and breathing in, creating a diversity of life that grows and has its movement and its becoming. And then when things fall apart, when some of those beings are excluded or marginalized, the reconciliation, the breathing in, brings it back together into that unity. So love creates and love reconciles. So what if creativity is the image of God that we bear? Not rational thought or static ideas like race or gender, which are all derived after the moment of creation, but the image of God and the likeness of God as life-giving relationship of diversity and harmony that is creative. That claim about God is relational. The Trinity is the source of life in which we live and move and have our being, as Luther said. But I also want to say that it's ontological, meaning it has implications for our reality, for what we are in nature. Social and biodiversity are the wisdom of God woven into the fabric of creation. Now, the narrative arc of the Bible can actually be read this way, because the creation story in Genesis is not a story of violence or cosmic rupture. It's a story of creativity that holds diversity in balance. Day and night, water and land, sky and sea, animals of the air, animals of the field, humans safeguarding that balance. Ours is a creation narrative of harmony. Sin, on the other hand, is narrated as a disintegration of this unitive consciousness, right? Think about what happens when sin enters the story. Adam and Eve realize that they're naked. They're turned in on each other with a shame and awareness of themselves over and above the creation or the relationship to the other. And then comes the story of the disintegration of that relationship, of ourselves from our spirit, of ourselves from the land and other species, of ourselves from God. And then as the story goes on, remember the story of the Tower of Babel, which is the story of humans' will to power, to stamp uniformity, to control diversity, right? So that we could have power over creation. But then the story goes on, and Pentecost is another celebration of the Spirit's recreation of diversity, the recreation of this capacity to speak and to share this one hope in multiple languages. And the story ends, of course, with this vision and revelation, which is the tree of life with a diversity of fruits and leaves for the healing of the nation. So we began in creativity of diversity, and we're returning to it. In the arc of the biblical narrative, this alpha and omega point shape our understanding of our relationships in the meantime. So that's a cosmology that shapes who we are as diverse creatures and our different ways of learning and making meaning. And so here is the anthropological question about who we are and how we make meaning in a world of diversity. Now, as a theologian, I like good questions, and there are a few good questions in the Bible, and Jesus asks a few of them. And one is, who do you say that I am? Now, the way we answer that question makes all the difference in the path that we follow. And this goes for pedagogical paths included. It can shape the way of how we think we know and how we learn. So, who do we say that we are? The word human comes from the same root of the word humus, meaning the earth. And remember that in Hebrew, the word Adam is not a name. It's a diminutive of the Hebrew word Adamah, which means red clay or soil. So Adam actually only means the earthling. Humans are made from the same stardust as the rest of all the creatures. And the Hebrew creation story states that the impulse to create Eve, which, again, remember, is also not a name, but a word that means the life bearer, the impulse to create the other was to have a relationship, companionship, a life-giving relationship. And remember that initially in the story, that relationship was primarily between the earthling and the more than human creatures before it took on any gendered aspects. So the focus of that relationship between the human and the more than human world was initially epistemological. It was about how we knew these other diverse beings. And the Hebrew describes the way that this earthling came to know these diverse beings with whom we share our common home. This is how it's said in Genesis 2:19. God brought the animals to the human to see what he would name them. Knowing, and therefore naming, grew first, you see, out of a relationship. Notice here that this is not a scientific gaze on some distant other being in the world. This is an embodied experience of two diverse beings being brought together that leads to a kind of deep relational knowing. Now, this is epistemologically significant, I want to say, for what it means to be human in a more than human world. And here I want to point us to a commitment that's found in LEA's lifelong qualities for learners. As central to their mission and ministry, Lutheran schools seek to nurture individuals who are aware of their humanity. Now, friends, God is certainly aware of our humanity. And in history, God revealed God's self to us in a diversity of embodied ways. So let's consider the stories of the birth of Jesus and the way that God chose to reveal the incarnation of divine love in the world. So we have two accounts in the Bible, right? From Luke and Matthew that tell three different epistemological stories. In Matthew, God revealed God's self by means of a star to the Magi from the east. And to the chief priests and scribes, they read the scrolls to deduce the message. But in Luke, God reveals this good news through the visitation of angels to shepherds in the fields. So the shepherds are presumably either illiterate or pre-literate people who live close to the land. And they perceive this message orally. It was a spoken message. The Magi are a group of proto-astronomers from a totally different culture who see their message through their observation of the natural world. The priests are a literate class who read their knowledge via received text. So see, what we have here is an epistemological diversity of ways that God makes known this one message. One voice, many epistemological paths. God is a good teacher. Now, when it comes to the relationship between revelation and human reason or perception, Lutherans have a really good tradition to stand upon. In Luther's Heidelberg Disputation in 1518, Luther publishes a set of theological and philosophical theses that critique Aristotle and sets up what many people think is a conflict between revelation, which is a religious or faith-based epistemology, and reason, which can be rational, philosophical, or phenomenological ways of knowing. But I want to say that it's not quite accurate to think of it as a conflict between reason and revelation. It was more of a defense of the proper roles of reason and revelation. Because don't forget that Luther was a spiritual theologian. He experienced the presence of God in the world. And in an Advent sermon, Luther wrote, "God has written the gospel not only in books, but also in trees and other creatures." Luther, firm in the logic of that confession of the real presence of Christ, Luther knows that the Trinity is immanently present behind the masks of God, which include all of creation. Luther writes, "God is fully present in all creatures, and I might find God in a stone, in fire, in water, or even in a rope, for God is there." But, Luther says, reason and our experience in the world can be ambiguous, right? There is predation, there is disease, there are accidents, and there is violence, after all. So he says that if we go out into the world looking for God in these ways, we might trip over the stone or burn ourselves in the fire or hang ourselves by the rope or drown in the river looking for God. So in order to safeguard us from that anxiety, or worse, from following some other path, Luther was clear that the only place where we can be sure of an unveiled revelation of our relationship to God, coram Deo, that is, in Latin, are those things that proclaim the revelation of Christ as gift and promise. For Lutherans, that's particularly in the Word and the sacraments. But we must use reason to discern the relative justice, goodness, and beauty that we perceive in our social, political, economic, and ecological relationships to the rest of the world. Luther knew that all forms of knowledge, political, scientific, social scientific, need to be involved for us to discern that civil use of the law, for us to understand and discern together how we are to use our freedom to love our neighbor and all creation. That's cora mundo. That's the horizontal. As each of us lives out our baptismal vocation in all other sectors and disciplines in life. And this was on clear display when Luther wrote economic and agricultural treatises on trade and usury, and refers to the most up-to-date, even though it's ancient now, the most up-to-date scientific knowledge in his response to the plague and how Christians should live during the time of plague, which was often quoted in the acute days of COVID-19. This is why, in public education, Luther is happy to keep Aristotle's books on logic, rhetoric, and most specifically, poetics, because poesis is a task of meaning-making. For Aristotle, this was not only poetry or art as we think of it today, it was techne. It was being an artisan, and that included being an artisan of many things, from fabricated goods to the fine and visual arts. Poesis, making, that creativity required a practice and an imitation to perceive and embody knowledge, even muscle memory, in the way that we practice musical instruments, for example. And there is an aesthetic to Luther's application of this diversity of epistemological sources. In his early work on the Psalms, listen to the way that he writes about perception in mind, body, and soul. This is what he writes. Thus the Creator has created all things in wisdom, so that they may minister in such countless functions and services not only to the body, but also to the soul, which can grasp the wisdom as far as the mind and heart are concerned. Indeed, the more profoundly a created thing is recognized, the more wonders are seen in it, namely, how it is full of God's wisdom. So Luther emphasized the need to deeply engage the world around us in contemplation with all of our diverse human faculties, because God, he writes, is a poet, and every creature are the verses and the songs that God makes and creates. Luther believes that receiving this good news through the word and sacrament liberates us and then sends us back out, leaping and dancing for great pleasure to rediscover the world and our relationships to other creatures. So he writes, we are beginning to acquire once again the knowledge of the creatures that was lost through Adam's fall. After having received the promise, we can look at these creatures much more correctly, he says. There's a German theologian named Oswald Baer that agrees that this enchanted view of the world gives us a renewed sense and taste for the finite, the diversity of beings that are around us. For what can be heard, felt, or tasted when we engage with the full epistemological diversity of our human senses. So, before making that turn to some pedagogical implications, I want to settle for a minute on this idea of this diversity of our senses as a fundamental human anthropological reality. I grounded my own research on the role that a phenomenological relationship to nature plays in the ecological formation of a child's sense of identity, specifically related to the work of a French philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and his work on field perception, the perception of the field that's around us. As we learn or simply move through our surroundings during the day, Merleau-Ponty shows how our field of perception creates sensory overlaps or intersections of all of our different senses. Our brains are constantly learning from the sensory information, the colors, the smells, even the energies and the intentions of other beings towards us that fill our daily interactions. And this, by the way, is what an Oxford study found a couple years ago is actually the source of Zoom fatigue. You all know it, right? Zoom fatigue, when you get off of a series of Zoom calls and you're exhausted. Neurologically, part of the reason is that your brain is trying to fill in the other cues around that head in a box, right? When you're sitting here together, you're sensing each other in a much more kind of passive way. You're looking at me, but your brain is actually sensing this person next to you and what you're doing here together. When we're on Zoom, your brain's looking for that information, and it's exhausting. We all know that feeling, right? Merleau-Ponty called this intersection of the senses synesthesia. Now, synesthesia is actually a condition where the stimulation of one sensory mode causes a simultaneous stimulation in another sense, in another part of the brain. So, for instance, a person who experiences synesthesia might hear a bird singing, and they might see the color purple. Or they'll look at the stars, and they hear the tinkling of diamonds. They might smell smoke and feel burning sensation on their skin. Or, for a synesthete, Wednesdays might look yellow. There is a neurological basis for this, because different areas in the brain that are in close proximity, again, like the cells, it's about the relationship in close proximity of the brain. They can create neural connections between these areas of the brain. And studies estimate that likely around 4% of the population experience some degree of synesthesia. So think about this. This is 4% of your students in a classroom. It might be higher because of underreporting, right? If you're reading aloud a story and a child sees colors, they may not tell you that because they think it's normal. I remember one time I asked my son what fruit he wanted for a snack, and he told me apples because they smile. But today, neuroscientists do not treat synesthesia as a pathology. And there are even theories that we're all born this way. We're all born this way as our brains are forming. But the socialization and education systems introduce our brains to learning in discrete epistemological ways, causing our brains to lose the synesthetic capacity. So this intersection of learning and the diversity of learning may in fact be a gift of our human nature that we unmake, that we uncreate in our educational patterns. So incidentally, J.M. Barrie's book, Peter Pan, how many of you have read? Not the Disney version, J.M. Barrie's book, yeah? This book begins with the idea that all human babies can understand the language of the birds, and we just forget it as we grow older. Now, Merleau-Ponty describes perception not as these discrete moments of learning, such as reading or computation or crafting, but like Heraclitus, our being in the world is a constant flux of synesthetic participation. So learning happens when we open ourselves to this totality of sensory diversity. David Abram, in his book Spell of the Sensuous, that I recommend to everybody, has demonstrated this in a remarkable way by studying the relationship between language and our perception of the natural world. And he shows how pre-literate cultures, such as those preserved by indigenous or aboriginal peoples, never forgot how to listen to creation. And serious dialogue with indigenous or traditional religions reveal that many shamans or healers do not actually claim to access some special revelation of knowledge. They nurture their capacity to perceive what the natural world is communicating. So what people from Western traditions call animism or totemism is not actually magic. It's the practice of a deep attentiveness to the intersubjective relationship to the more than human creatures and the land. So think of our friends, the Aboriginal people who walk in dream time through the land. They simply hear the stories that are told by what they see and what they experience where they are as they're moving through the land. And what it is a practice of being open to simply be addressed by the more than human world. How many of you have seen the light kind of break through leaves in a wonderful way? Or a bird alight somewhere, or a spider that's weaving a web that seems to just call your attention somehow? Do you know that feeling of just letting yourself be addressed by the more than human other in the world? Well, Abrams shows how language evolved to actually be disconnected from the land and the creatures. So early pictoglyphs, like those that you see on the left, were often pictures of the being or the sounds that being made in the world, right? They represented the actual image or sound of the being. Then, the ancient Hebrew Aleph-Bet system maintains still a great deal of this multisensory relationality. You see it here in the middle. This is the ancient Hebrew version of the letter Mem. That's the letter that describes the sea or the ocean. You see the ripples in the waves. Or the word for wind or spirit is ruach. Ruach, which, do you hear it? Do you feel it? When you speak, it breathes when you say it properly. Ruach. And think of the passages like Isaiah 55:11, which says, "My word goes out and it will not return empty." And other verses where the word is interactive and it's creative, not static words on a page. But Scripture was meant to be read aloud or spoken to people in a gathering, not read silently on a page, because the speaking and the hearing had a synesthetic effect. Ezekiel, remember, ate the scroll. The psalmist asks us to listen to the voice of creation proclaiming the glory of God. Taste and see how the Lord is good. Friends, these are not metaphors. Consider the Talmud in the Kabbalist traditions in Judaism, where letters brought to mind sacred numbers, and altering the letter combinations when we read a passage can create new insight and interpretations. Now, some languages have preserved these pictorial relationships, such as Chinese, which you see here on your right is the character for peace, an. And if you look at it, not exactly peace, but harmony. There are a few words for peace. When you look at it, what you're seeing is a roof that's over top of the figure of a woman. Do you see it? She's sheltered in a house. This is the word for peace. But the Greek language took that Aleph-Bet system and ordered the letters phonetically, rendering words as static, semantic symbols that lost their aesthetic connection to the being that they represented. So here's an example. The letters C-O-W. They communicate an animal in your mind, right? But that word, C-O-W, bears no resemblance or relationship to the creature that it refers. So in Greek or in Latin, words could now communicate meaning on their own, totally separate from creation around us. So in the Phaedrus, actually, this is great. Socrates, who is one of the first literate Greek philosophers, right, cries out You must forgive me. I'm a lover of learning, and trees and open country won't teach me anything. Written words, he says, seem to talk to you as though they were intelligent. Now, why am I telling you all this? Why is this significant? Because most people from a Western perspective think that we are not animist or shamanistic, right? Objects do not speak to us, correct? But when you see the lines scratched on a page, don't you hear what they communicate to you? So I want to do a little experiment. I want you to grab your phones if you need to, but close your eyes. Everybody close your eyes and try to clear your mind and try to hear nothing but my voice. Now, most of you are probably seeing black right now and hearing nothing. But I'm about to change the screen in front of you, and in a minute, I'm going to ask you to open your eyes again and to read what is on the screen. But when you do, I want you to read it silently, and I want you to listen. Not just see, but also what you hear. So, open your eyes. Now raise your hand if you heard what you saw. When you read that silently, who heard in their head your own voice? Yeah, you heard it, right? That is a synesthetic connection. When you read silently, you're hearing what you see on the screen. See, to Europeans, European descent, from the Western epistemological perspective, the way indigenous people read the land and other creatures appears as magical. But indigenous people looked at Europeans who read in the same way, because these lines on a page communicated the exact same knowledge to everyone in this room at the same time, and none of us talked to each other. For First Nations people, reading this way appears to be some kind of magic that they cannot perceive. Now, one of the tools of colonialism is epistemological hegemony. If you separate people from the land, that communicates to them in this synesthetic way. If you teach them your symbolic and linguistic way of making meaning that has no tie to the land, like in the children of Peter Pan, if they're separated long enough, they will forget. Then they're only left to make meaning according to your symbolic way of thinking. And Abram sums this up nicely in this phrase: when words begin to speak, rocks fall silent. So to separate humans from the land and our meaning-filled relationships to other creatures is a particular kind of violence. And the topic of my own book, Greening the Children of God, explores the poetry of Thomas Traherne. Now, he was a 17th century Anglican theologian who saw this Baconian divergence between the natural sciences and the humanities, namely theology, in the curriculum of schools. They were starting to diverge right at that point when he lived. It was at the dawn of the scientific revolution, and he saw the deadly result of forcing children to privilege one epistemological approach, particularly that of the predominant order, over all the others. And in a poem called "The Sun and the Moon Forgot," this is how he describes that epistemological violence. As if unmade, appear no more to me, to God and heaven dead was I, as though they never were. Upon some useless gaudy book, when what I knew of God was fled, the child being taught to look, his soul was quickly murdered. That's heavy language. But his fear was realized when Newton's mechanical approach to the natural science actually weaponized physics with, remember Parmenides? Parmenides' metaphysics of this static hyper-individuation that sets in motion an era of Western scientific epistemological hegemony that Carolyn Merchant actually calls the death of nature. And this mechanistic individualism or duality colonized our social and economic ideas so much that our political economies ever since have resulted in a sort of silent spring that Rachel Carson warned about. We no longer hear the singing of the birds, partly because of the loss of biodiverse species from the Earth community, but mostly a loss of our deep ecological relationships to them and our inability to make sense of what they're saying to us. Now, Richard Louv observes how disconnecting children from this full range, this epistemological field of their more than human surroundings creates what he calls a nature deficit disorder. And that's becoming a significant facet of modern anthropology. And with Louv, I propose that privileging one mode of learning is actually the disordered condition. An openness to synesthetic perception is actually more fully human. And in any case, if separation from the land and that epistemic hegemony is the tool of colonization, then surely for Lutherans, the goal of liberating, decolonizing, and transformative education is to nurture a child to come to life by reconnecting them with diverse modes of learning, which honors our holistic theological anthropology of who we are as God made us. And I want to connect to a significant statement in LEA's framework that affirms all useful knowledge and learning is God's gift to people for their well-being. Service to others through actions and relationships is a reflection and response of God's love for all. So I hear many paths as a call to promote a diversity of learning and learning styles as part of a spirituality of education. And here, spirituality does not just relate to religious education or religious literacy, but all modes of learning are spiritual in the sense that each of our senses nurtures some aspect of our whole selves and equips us for learning and serving coram mundo with those in the world around us in the diverse sectors of life to which our children are being prepared. So I want to close by making the pedagogical turn. What does this mean for a school? I think educators in the Lutheran context should, like Luther, be the first ones to run leaping and dancing towards implementing epistemologically diverse pedagogies. Educators like Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings were some of the first to push for learning in another voice. And this week, I'm thrilled about the program. We're going to hear from many of you who are innovating in these ways. And I just want to mention two types. The first stop for schools today, I think, is to acknowledge the pedagogical needs related to neurodiversity and multiple intelligence. So balancing more traditional means with the need for diverse approaches to interdisciplinary learning increases inclusion and equity for those children and adults who feel certain modes of learning are like magic to them. In addition to neurodiversity, this includes children who come from diverse cultural and gendered backgrounds, and therefore different epistemological perspectives. And thank you to Kiernan, who said this and showed this to us this morning. And for this reason, I appreciate that the LEA framework states in its belief about learners that all learners are valued for who they are and whose they are, and that learning is facilitated when individual needs of students are met. Now, I don't know what percentage of students in ECE or primary schools in Australia have IEPs, but the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership estimates that 4.5% have an acute need for individuation. And that's actually low compared to UNESCO's 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report that encourages inclusion as a way to overcome discrimination, stereotyping, and stigmatization. And here, I just want to mention by way of prayer the LWF's developing support of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in the Ukraine. Right now, with a reaction team, we are mapping the need for early childhood education as part of our refugee response that will require trauma-sensitive pedagogies. And trauma-sensitive pedagogies are growing more necessary in areas of acute or post-conflict education, but also we see of children coming out of COVID restrictions. So secondly, the second point, is LEA's belief about learning. You affirm that learning goes beyond the academic. It includes the spiritual, physical, emotional, and social, and has affective or volitional dimensions, as well as cognitive. So this belief highlights this benefit of interdisciplinary approaches to applying methods, for example, across a curriculum. I'm thinking of a child with dysgraphia who might struggle to write a biology paper, but can create a beautiful sculpture to raise public awareness of our relationship to our local ecology. So interdisciplinary teaching across a curriculum can encourage students who thrive in one subject's mode of learning to make meaning in another. For example, using art or musicology to teach history, teaching biological sciences through the environmental humanities, like poetry, or allowing mathematics students to create musical compositions for their summative evaluations, in addition to the formulas and computations. And offering these opportunities for what I call dialogical aesthetics, the aesthetics of dialogue between these different disciplines, encourages students to find their path into a discipline whose internal logic might seem to them otherwise magical. So in the LWF, we partner with local projects like that of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Jordan and the Holy Land in their Environmental Education Center that actually teaches peace education and interfaith literacy through earth care practices. Among Muslim, Jewish, and Christian youth, they find their common relationship to the land becomes a shared source of knowledge that unites diverse religious and social programs, identities into one cosmological sense of home. And in our Climate Justice and Faith certificate program, every student finishes their studies with a capstone or sacred action project that engages their interdisciplinary learning in a public-facing initiative in loving service and action for the world. Now this week, I'm particularly looking forward to the workshops focusing on turning children into action heroes and learning through the arts. But I'm more generally also looking forward just to hearing from you. What kinds of epistemological diversity do you see in your students? What ways of knowing are privileged or are marginalized in your curriculum? And how is this topic of epistemic diversity part of the pedagogical conversations in your school? I hope to have more conversations with you about this, but for now, I just want to close with a word of gratitude to LEA for developing your culture in your schools with a particular Lutheran ethos. And I hope that I've contributed to that ethos in some way today. I hope that I've affirmed the idea that for Lutherans, the commitment to diverse epistemologies and interdisciplinary ways of learning actually honor and embody our full God-given formed identity as human beings, and in turn shapes the way we approach diversity in the world, seeking harmony out of our call to participate in peace. So I want to leave you with one last example of this, because Luther believed that music education must be kept in primary school. Why? Because making music is an experience of peacemaking. When you play music together, you learn to play your role and your note in rhythm and harmony with your fellow child of God, and that reveals to everyone around an aesthetic of peace. Lutheran schools can connect revelation and reason in one relational cosmology of diverse peoples and the planet. And in a world that needs creative synergy as a sign of hope, our classrooms can make the aesthetic connections that honor the God-gifted diverse parts of our own selves so that each of us is reintegrated to become a person at peace as we learn to faithfully walk along our many paths towards peace. So thank you, friends.
Thank you, Chad. And I hope you're all feeling like I am, as if you've just been on an amazing journey. Chad, I'd just like to give you a couple of things that I've noted. You have taken us on a journey. It's been one of learning. It's also been one of reassurance and gratefulness. You've brought Luther's work and God's promise to life through your presentation, which has challenged and enlightened us. It's also reassured us in our work as educators in Lutheran schools. You've reminded us of the presence of God in all of creation, and in particular in the individually and diverse students that we have the pleasure and the joy of educating. Not just them, but their families, and how we can continue to support them and each of their gifts, and seeing them indeed as one of God's creations. Thank you so much. We do have some questions that we're going to just respond to. We've got a few minutes, but first, one question, Chad, if I may. Lutheran Education is currently articulating our vision for learners and for learning into the next 20 years. We feel that we're called to be brave and bold. The question: what special contribution do you see that Lutheran education communities can make to the flourishing of children, young people and the world?
It's a great and a really broad question, but I think I like the brave part of the brave and the bold. Well, the bold part as well. But I think one of the issues that we all probably sense in our children and in adult populations as well is kind of acute anxieties. Now, one of the ways this is expressed is in eco-anxiety, right? Psychologists are starting to actually diagnose this anxiety in children over the ecological realities. But I think that sort of the crises of political, economic, ecological, social narratives that we see in the world, and again, this is related to diversity and the one and the many, are very similar to the time of the Reformation, right? There was great political and social upheaval. There was an emerging global economy. There was a pandemic that swept across Europe. I mean, some of those same anxieties were there, and they created these existential questions for Luther and for other people. And I think one of the things was about the Lutheran Reformation was that bravery and that boldness to say, where is the hope? And really to be brave, to reform whatever it was that was creating those anxieties. The power structures, the systems, whether it was church, politics, culture, and society, to say what has been revealed through Christ to us is this horizon of hope. And we need to reorient ourselves to that horizon. So if you see that endpoint, then everything else in the middle the path becomes a little bit clearer, you know? So today, in light of the anxieties that we face, I think the word of hope and the image of hope that we have to hold on to can really create a cosmology for our kids, first of all, which is our number one trust, and then for each other, to not only heal those anxieties, but to give that brave and bold answer that we know where we're going to go. And it might be diverse, because the question of what does it mean to love my neighbor in this situation might look different than that one. But if we know that what our freedom frees us to do is just to love somebody, to love our neighbor, to love creation, then that horizon of hope becomes a little more clear. So I think, as Lutherans in this moment, I think that gift still holds, even more now maybe than it did even in the 16th century. So brave and bold, I like it. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you, and I'm aware that we're about 10 minutes from lunch, so we're just going to finish with one more question. Thank you for those people that have submitted questions via the app. I'm just wondering which one we'll do. There's a question. What did Luther say about how to live in times of the plagues, which you mentioned when you were quoting in COVID times?
Yes. Good. I wish I had the quotes in front of me. There were two significant things I think that Luther said. Now, first of all, remember, he was writing letters, okay? If you want to read Luther's writings, I think his letters are some of the most brilliant places to start, because he's writing to people with real questions. And one of them was to a woman who had had a miscarriage. He wrote a letter to his barber when he asked him how to pray. So this specific letter was to priests who were asking in the time of the Black Plague, should they flee or should they stay? And he did two things. One was to talk about vocation. So he said, remember that our vocation is called to love those that are entrusted to us. So you might be a priest, but you're also, let's say, a parent or a spouse. So you have to discern, you know, where your responsibility lies in your situation. So in other words, he called us to discernment about these issues. The second was he actually said to listen to what was a public health order at the time, based on the best science they had, which I agree that included wearing masks with the long noses and spraying smoke, and okay, so it's not the best natural science today. But his point was, there are those in public health who base their life on understanding these things. Trust them, listen to them. They're trying to make good decisions based on our collective health. And that's what, in times of COVID, you know, when we were debating, what do we do, who do we listen to, where do our rights and our responsibilities overlap, it was always, Luther was saying, the love to the other. And how you discern what that means that you do, listen to all of these, okay? Listen to how God calls you to love, listen to the scientists, listen to those who are putting in these public health guidelines. So, again, it's late medieval, but I encourage you to read it because it's helpful today.
We're all very familiar with public health guidelines at the moment, aren't we, in schools? Thank you so much, Chad. I'd just like to thank you on behalf of all of us for such an outstanding presentation that has kick-started the next 3 days in such a powerful way. It's challenged us, it's taught us, it's left us with questions, and I think that's, as educators, it's a good place to be. We always want our children to leave with questions, and for me I love the concept of the action. That's a really powerful thing. No learning is true learning unless action comes from it. So I'd really like to ask you to put your hands together and thank Chad for his involvement. And there's that here, and I'll just leave it over there, and I'll just say for you. Now, before we head out for lunch, I'd just like to pray for Chad, and then I'll lead us into grace. Thank you. Let's pray. Father God, creator of our amazing world, we thank you for the gifts, the leadership, the knowledge and the teaching that Chad has delivered today. We ask a blessing on him as he responds to your voice, as he leads in his role at Lutheran World Federation and beyond. Guide and strengthen him and his family. Give him peace and courage as he continues to do your work. We thank you, Lord, for the blessings of Chad today. In your name we pray. Amen. And let's pray grace together. Come, Lord Jesus, please join me. Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest, and let this food to us be blessed. Amen. Thank you all for your attention this afternoon. That's been fantastic. We're going to move back into the exhibition hall for lunch. Please ensure you're back here ready to move into our next session before 2:30. We'd like to start right on time so we can enjoy some wonderful fellowship also this afternoon at the end of the sessions. If you could just please thank Chad Rimmer one more time.